I'm leaving them on. Sorry. I tried to wake y'all up. I tried to wake y'all drunk asses up. Y'all not doing it. Y'all blacked out. I'm out of here. Sup? Yeah.
Today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories about places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button's car to the car wash. But before you actually take it inside, be sure you roll all their windows.
Oh, God.
Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
Help! Dice roll! Sheesh!
Around 10 p.m. on September 9th, 1975, a 24-year-old man named Roger Baldwin and his coworker, 29-year-old Peter Holmes, frantically crawled on hands and knees as fast as they could down a hallway towards the door of their apartment. And the reason they were crawling and not standing and walking or running is because this was no ordinary apartment. This apartment was basically like a metal box with a bunch of interconnected metal tubes that was located 200 miles off the coast of Scotland, basically out in the middle of the ocean. And it was also underwater. And the reason for that is it was connected to an offshore oil rig. And oil...
Look at that! How much do the people that work on them oil rigs get paid? Because it has to be a hazard in itself just to be there. Like, look at that. All kinds of waves and, oh man, they got to get paid top dollar, no?
Often need divers, like deep sea divers, to work on the rig down deep in the water. But if you know anything about underwater diving, especially deep underwater diving, is that it's not as simple as just throwing on some scuba tanks and going down into the water and doing your work and coming back up again. No, if you're working on an oil rig down at depth, like an underwater welder or anybody who does work for a while deep underwater, there's lots of risks associated with going from the surface down deep where there's really intense pressures and you're breathing in different mixed gases that can interact with your body in sort of very terrible ways. It's dangerous. That's the reality of it. Going down to depth and then coming back up again is a very dangerous process unless you know what you're doing. It's more efficient for owners of oil rigs to construct these pressurized apartments underwater for their deep sea divers to live in, so that when they go out to the rig, they only have to go down to depth once, live in the apartment, which imagine a cup that you just push down into water. There's like an air pocket, right? You push it deep into the water. They basically would swim up under into this apartment deep underwater, and they live there and dive back out of there, do their work, come back into their apartment, but their bodies never really leave the working depth until the end of their shift, whether it's weeks or months or however long they're out there. And then they only have to decompress one time. So in essence, you get to work, you go down deep, and you stay there effectively for a long time, and when you're done working, you go back to the surface. And so that's why that apartment existed, and that's sort of the setup for these two guys. They've been living underwater. But at that moment, Roger and Peter were not thinking about their diving responsibilities. They were rushing down this metal tube hallway that led to their apartment, because over the intercom, the folks on the surface, their supervisor, had communicated down to them that there was some sort of leak happening in the hallway. And so they basically had to rush into their apartment and seal the door behind them before the air basically vanished in the hallway and they suffocated. So they're crawling as fast as they can. They finally get to their apartment door. They open it up. They go inside. They shut it and they seal it. And now they're sitting there with their backs against the door, hoping that the leak was contained to the hallway, and they're looking up into the corner of their small metal room, their main living space, where there's bunks, and there's also the entrance down into the water, basically right in front of them. and there's this camera up in the corner of this room looking down at them, and they have no way to directly communicate with their supervisor on the surface, but they know their supervisor has access to that camera, and he's looking at them on his monitor, and his black and white, monitor, and so they're looking up at this camera, hoping that their supervisor is watching them and is doing everything he needs to do to officially contain this leak. Basically, Roger and Peter, they can shut their door, but they can't fully seal it. The full seal comes when somebody on the surface, their supervisor, injects helium into their room, basically adds more pressure to their room, which then sucks the door fully sealed, and then they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they're listening carefully for the sound of that injection of helium into the room, and eventually they hear it, and there's some creaking on the door, and it sounds very much like their door is fully sealed, and now they're safe. And so Roger and Peter, they step away from the door, they sort of look up at the camera and say, "Thank you." And they're like, "All right, I hope that leak out in the hallway is our only issue here." Now, it's worth pointing out that things like this, as terrifying as that would be, you're deep underwater and over the intercom they're saying there's a leak, like that would be horrifying, but this is a really dangerous job. And unfortunately, leaks and other things like that just sort of happened. And so Roger and Peter were kind of accustomed to things like this happening. And they just had to, hope that the folks on the surface would do their best to, mitigate the problems and, keep them safe. At this point, though, Roger and Peter knew that, it didn't seem like there were any other emergencies here. Whatever leak was happening in the hallway, that could be dealt with. If they had to, they could actually just leave their apartment with their diving equipment on and make their way back up to the surface. Like, there were ways for them to get out of here. And they're thinking, okay, our room has been fully sealed off. We heard the helium be injected into the room. The door's shut behind us. Like, we're good. And again, they can't directly communicate to the supervisor. The supervisor's not saying anything over the intercom. And so they think, okay, it's good for us to just take our stuff off and go to bed.
What?
So that's what they do. They take off their diving equipment and they climb into their beds and they turn out the lights.
Oh, no.
At the same time they were climbing into bed, their supervisor up on the surface, a guy named Reed Arnold, who'd been talking to them over the intercom, he was sitting there looking at this big control panel with all these switches and gauges and monitors that controlled their underwater apartment. And unfortunately for him, even though it did seem like the leak in the hallway was relatively contained, although it still was leaking, he was also now noticing that there was another problem that he wasn't telling Roger and Peter about yet. And that was, apparently, the door to their apartment, despite them closing it clearly and him injecting helium into the room, following all the steps, it appeared like the door somehow did not fully seal.
Oh.
Which meant there was a slow leak. And over time, if this wasn't fixed, the pressure would drop so severely in that room that that could be fatal for Roger and Peter. Like, this is an emergency, but it's sort of a slow one. And so Reed took a minute and kind of assessed the situation. And, the only thing he could do to try to close this door, to fully seal it, let's say, is to inject more helium into Roger and Peter's room. Not enough to harm them, but just enough to further push that door closed. And so he did that. He injected a little bit more helium, and he's watching the gauge of their room, become even more pressurized. But the indicator that showed whether or not the door was sealed continued to show that it was not. And so as Reed is sitting there wondering what he's going to do next, he looked over at the monitor that was the live feed into the room, where he could actually watch Roger and Peter, that camera in the corner of the room. And he sees the two men are laying in their beds, but then sort of out of nowhere, they both get up, climb off their beds, and they hustle over to the door, the leaky door, and they start trying to open it. But from the feed, as he's looking at it, it seems very apparent that they can't get the door to open. It's like it's stuck. And Reed's thinking to himself, that doesn't make any sense. I have this indication light that says the door isn't sealed, so even if it was a challenge to open the door, it's not pressure sealed. They should be able to open it. So what is going on here? And so Reed, he's beginning to panic a little bit because he just doesn't understand what's happening here. And as he's watching Roger and Peter, they go from frantically trying to open this door to almost in unison stopping, turning around, walking over to their bunks, and then grabbing their mattresses, taking them off, and then Roger and Peter climbed onto their metal bed springs and began rolling around on the metal. Now, it's worth pointing out that there are some diving-related injuries, like from being at depth for too long, or hypercapnia, where you have too much CO2 in your system. There's a whole bunch of things that can basically mess with your mind. And so Reed's thinking, oh my goodness, something's happened that's given these guys some sort of diving-related injury. like they're acting crazy. This must be a problem.
Well, if you're so damn worried about it, why don't you come down here and help us out? That's the CO2. That's much more in my body than normal. That's what reacting. I'm sorry, it wasn't meant for you to be lashing out. I didn't mean to do all of that. It's just that's a lot more CO2 in my body than normal. So just it's not towards you. I'm just saying, come down here and get us.
Of something wrong. They're breathing the wrong mixture of gas. Maybe there's too much helium. Maybe there's too much CO2. Like, I don't know what's going on, but there is an issue here that's messing with their brains. Like, that's the only explanation for why they could be doing something so bizarre. And so at this point, Reed decides all he can do is just continue to put more helium into that room to try to seal that door. Maybe there's some sort of toxic gas that's getting into their space that's causing them to hallucinate or go crazy or who knows what. And so he's just firing off this button, adding more and more helium into the room. And after doing this for several minutes and still watching on the monitor as Roger and Peter continue to do this weird writhing around on their bed frames, that was around the time that Reed really focused on his controls. Like, am I missing something? Is there some other indication on here that gives away what's going on here? And that's when he realized he had made a terrible mistake. It would turn out Reed had misread the control panel. There really had been a leak in the hallway, and he was right to tell Peter and Roger to rush into their apartment. But once they were inside the apartment and they shut the door and that
just pissed me off. It is your job to protect these men. Like, literally, their life is on your hands, and you misread something? Come on, man. Come on. Jesus.
Reed injected helium into their room. He actually did seal that room off. There was no issue in their apartment. They were totally safe. There was no problem. He was just misreading the control panel. He thought when he saw this additional indication that, the apartment door had not sealed, that was indicative of a leak in their apartment. But no, the controls were really trying to tell him that, hey, there's still a leak in the hallway right outside of their apartment. And so basically, what Reed ended up doing by injecting more and more helium into the apartment where Roger and Peter were is he was creating a deadly pressure chamber. And the reason the men began acting the way they were is because the room was getting hotter and hotter and hotter from all this pressure. They could feel it, building inside of the space. And so they didn't know what was going on. They tried to get out, but they couldn't open the door because it was pressure sealed. And then they took their mattresses off their bed and began rolling around on the metal to try to cool down. But it was so intensely hot and it was so pressurized that you can imagine the chaos and panic these two men felt. Like, yeah, maybe theoretically they could have thrown on all their equipment and dove out of there, but you got to remember this is happening abruptly and they're basically boiling alive. And so it's like full-blown fight or flight mode, and these men are just trying to cool down, but they can't. And so every time Reed injected more and more helium into that room, he was raising the pressure and therefore the temperature in that small space, and eventually he boiled Roger and Peter alive. In the end, the supervisor, Reed, did not...
All because you misread these nuts. I'm sorry.
...actually face any criminal charges. Because, one, it was a genuine mistake, but two, the mistake was one that many people would have made. There was basically an issue with this control board that sort of presented problems in a sort of ambiguous way. And so it really wasn't Reed being negligent, it was just a flaw in the control panel.
So, it was the engineers, it was the people that designed this, that right there. That's their fault. It's somebody's fault. It's somebody's fault. Jesus. Being boiled alive is crazy.
At 11:40 a.m. on November 29th, 1986, a 36-year-old volunteer fire chief named Jack Schofstall parked his fire truck on a country road right next to this huge farm in rural Indiana. Jack was there with his assistant chief named Donald Schnitker. After parking, Jack looked down the road and he saw the owner of this farm, Jeffrey Wolf, was standing on the side of the road, waving to them and turning around and pointing back towards his property. And so Jack and Donald, they looked out the window, out in the direction that Jeff was pointing, and they saw there was this huge storage building off in the distance that clearly was part of the farm, and there appeared to be this thin plume of smoke coming off the top of it. And so Jack and Donald hop out of the fire truck, they hustle over to Jeffrey, and the three of them jog across the property over to this building. And when they get there, again, it's very clear that something is burning inside of this building. But this storage building was packed to the brim with stuff. Like, there was no way to get into the storage building from the front. Really, the only way to actually look inside of this building to see what was burning is by climbing up this ladder that ran to the top of this, 80-foot tall building, where at the very top there was a window that looked down into the storage building. And so basically Jack and Jeff said they would climb the ladder up to the top. Donald, the assistant chief, he would stay on the ground. And Jack and Jeffrey would go up there, look inside, and see if they could actually figure out what was burning so they could make a decision about how to approach this, what equipment they might need and what to do. And so Jack and Jeff, they make their way up this ladder to the very top. They get to this window, and Jack, he looks inside, and again, it's very clear something is burning in here, but he can't tell where it's coming from. He sees smoke coming out right next to him, but it's just there's so much stuff inside of this building, you just can't tell where it's coming from. But Jeffrey clearly had placed this big piece of plywood on the very top of all the stuff inside of the storage building as sort of like a makeshift platform if you wanted to, walk inside of this building in the one area you could walk into. And so he turned to look at Jeffrey and he's like, yeah, you can stand on that. And so Jack climbed through the window. And so he gets on there. It's kind of like he's surfing, basically balancing on the top of all this stuff, at the very top of this massive building. And he's looking around, but now Jack has a better vantage point. He's sort of more in the center of this big building. And as he's looking around, he identifies where this fire is coming from. Now, this was not some enormous fire, but he really had no way to attempt to put it out without leaving the building, going back down, and getting more equipment. And so Jack, who's still standing on this piece of plywood, he pulls out his radio, and he radios down to Donald, the assistant chief, who's down on the ground, and he says, hey, we located the fire, we're gonna come back down, get our equipment, we'll come back up here, we'll put this thing out, we'll be good. But after Jack put the radio back on his belt, and he turned to walk back across this plywood, back to the window, and down the ladder. Before he got off the plywood, there was this low rumbling sound that came from right underneath his feet. At the same time, Donald, who's back down on the ground and who's just received this radio call from his partner saying, hey, we're gonna leave right now and get our equipment and put this fire out. Donald, he's down there staring up at the exit, up at the top there where Jack and Jeffrey had gone. And so far, he hasn't seen either of them come out of this building. It's just been silence. Like, he heard a little bit of a rumbling sound inside of this building, and he didn't really know what it was, but, no one's coming out of the building. He's thinking how strange that is. Like, Jack just said he was coming out to get his equipment. Where is he? And so Donald grabs his radio and begins repeatedly calling Jack to say, hey, where are you? You said you were coming out. Where are you guys? What's going on? But he didn't get an answer. And so really quickly, Donald realized there could be an emergency inside of this building. Like, for all we know, the fire is way worse and they're trapped, or who knows what's going on. But based on protocol, Donald couldn't just on his own go charging up the ladder and go right in there to, save the day, because he has no idea what he's walking into. He needs to make sure that he calls for help, gets other people here, and then can help explain what's going on here, instead of he himself going up there and potentially being another casualty. And so, instead of climbing that ladder, Donald began calling for help. And very quickly, an entire fleet of additional firefighters and police officers and ambulances showed up. There's all these people descending on the farm. And really quickly, first responders climbed up that ladder. They looked inside of the building and they figured out what happened. So when Jack climbed through that window at the top of this building, and he stood on top of that piece of plywood that Jeffrey had placed up there on top of all the stuff in the storage building. And, he was standing there balancing himself as he's looking around for where this fire is. Eventually, that rumbling under his feet was all the stuff underneath the plywood shifting, and he sort of lost his balance, and Jack fell off the plywood into basically the sea of stuff inside the storage building. And Jeffrey, when he saw this happen, he had not fallen in, but he turned and basically tried to get in there and grab on to Jack to get him out. But he too inadvertently fell into what was inside of this building. And what was inside of this building was corn. This was an 80-foot tall grain silo packed to the brim with grain. And so that piece of plywood was resting on the surface of the grain. And so when Jack fell into the grain, it was like it swallowed him whole, like quicksand.
Oh, God.
And Jeffrey, in an attempt to save Jack, also fell in, got swallowed whole, and they disappeared and suffocated.
Jesus!
It would ultimately take nearly 3 hours for bulldozers to basically break apart this building and sift through all the corn to finally locate Jack and Jeffrey.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I can't. Hey, hold on. Oh, but can you imagine? Oh, trying to breathe, either through your nose or your mouth. In every breath, it's a corn just get, oh God. A stiff drink. Sus. Because what's stiff? I'm not, what?
At 2 a.m. on December 2nd, 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall slowly climbed a flight of stairs inside of a lighthouse that was located on this tiny island off the southwest coast of England. Even though Henry was in his 90s, he was still working as a lighthouse keeper out at this lighthouse. I mean, by the way, that is a very rugged job, especially in the late 1700s. I mean, if there's ever any emergency of any kind out on this island, there's virtually no communication back and forth to the mainland, and help can't really get out to you very easily.
What's the point of a lighthouse? To let you know that there's civilization there? Or I don't understand what the point of a lighthouse is. To let people know of natural disasters? I don't understand.
So you're kind of on your own. I mean, lighthouse keepers at the time were sort of viewed as these very rugged, sort of survivalist types. And here's Henry, at 94 years old, still doing this job. But it was because he loved it. And in fact, even to this day, he remains on record the oldest active lighthouse keeper ever. On this particular night, the other two lighthouse keepers that were staying on this island with Henry and working with him, they were passed out drunk in their beds. They basically had drank the whole night away, and they were out for the count. But, Henry sort of expected this. It was his job that night to do the night shift, the worst shift, if you will, where all night, every 30 minutes, he had to, one, stay sober, and two, hike his way up to the very top of the lighthouse and make sure the lighthouse was still emitting light. And so that's what he was doing right now. He was heading up to the so-called lantern room at the very top of the spire, the actual lighthouse. And you gotta remember that this is in 1755, so this is before electricity. And so the light that was coming out of this lighthouse were literally a whole bunch of candles that were situated in this big chandelier that kind of hung down from the very top of the spire. And then above, where the candles are all resting in the chandelier, was this big dome that was the very top of the lighthouse. And the dome was lined with lead, and there was also lots of windows all around. And so the lead sort of reflected all the light and pushed all the light out all the windows. And so basically Henry's job, or any of these lighthouse keepers, when it was their turn to do this, they had to go up to the lantern room and make sure all the candles were lit. And if they weren't lit, relight them. That was basically it. Now, Henry had been checking on lighthouses for decades. Doing these every 30-minute checks of the candles was completely routine. And so Henry's making his way up, thinking nothing of it. Like, this is going to be completely mundane. I'm going to go up, check the lights, come back down. I'll do it again in 30 minutes, all night. That's all it's going to be. Doesn't expect anything to happen. But on this night, at around 2 a.m., as he's making his way up the stairs, as he's right near the top of the stairs and he's about to turn the corner and see, this big chandelier, it's called a candelabra. And right as he's turning the corner, he starts to smell smoke. And then when he turns the corner, he's looking out at this, completely lit up chandelier, the candelabra, and he doesn't see where the smoke is coming from until he looks up at the lead dome that sort of sat right above all the candles and reflected the light. And this lead dome had been here for a long time. This was an old lighthouse. And you could see there was all this buildup of soot on the underside of this lead dome from the candles being so close to it. And clearly some of the soot that was caked on the underside of this dome was starting to smolder. It was not on fire yet, but it was starting to smolder, and some smoke was filling up the lantern room. And so for whatever reason, Henry decided the best thing for him to do was to open up a window, because all the windows were shut at this point. He's thinking, get the smoke out. So he opens up a window, But when he does, it creates a vacuum effect, and all this air gets pulled into the lantern room, and oxygen, it sort of acts as an oxidizing agent for fire. It basically accelerates fire, and so oxygen is pulled up, and the dome just ignites into flames. Basically, Henry threw a lit match onto the dome. That's the equivalent of what he did. And so suddenly, Henry's staring at this wall of fire on the roof of this lighthouse, and also above the lead dome, the actual structure itself of the lighthouse was wood. And so Henry has no idea what to do. He knows this is obviously a massive emergency. And so as quick as he can, he turns and goes down the stairs, down into the bunk room where his two colleagues are, who are passed out drunk in their beds. And he's trying to shake them awake and tell them we have this huge fire, but they're so drunk that they don't wake up.
Wow.
And so Henry's on his own. He needs to do something about this. And so he gives up on his colleagues, and he starts walking back up the stairs towards this bunk.
What? Okay. If I'm doing this on my own, then I'm leaving on my own. I'm not, you got it. It's a lighthouse. If I'm doing this on my own, I'm leaving on my own. Sorry. I tried to wake y'all up. I tried to wake y'all drunk up. Y'all not doing it. Y'all blacked out. I'm out of here. I'm doing it what?
And he starts making his way up the stairs, but before he reaches the lantern room, right before maybe 5-6 feet down below, still on the stairs, there was this outcropping, like a balcony that jutted outside of the actual lighthouse. And so he stepped out onto this balcony, and standing out here, now he's outside, he turned and could look up, and basically right in front of him is the roof, and it's on fire. It's like right in front of him. And out on this balcony were all these buckets that were out there to collect rainwater, because it rained a lot out here. And so there's all these buckets of water, and Henry decides all he can do is start lobbing this water up onto the roof to hopefully put this fire out. And so one by one, he's hauling these buckets of water and chucking the water up on the roof, and it's really not making a difference, and he's so tired and exhausted, and the heat from the flames is so intense. Like, he knows he's not making much of a difference here. But just then, he hears his two colleagues come bounding up the stairs, and they're totally panicked. And even though they're drunk, it's clear they're kind of sobering up when they see the scene here. And so they instinctively run out on the balcony with Henry, and all three of them are now grabbing buckets, and they're looking up, and they're chucking the water up onto the roof. And Henry at one point sort of positioned himself a little bit closer to the edge and was like right underneath the dome, throwing water up, and it didn't matter. It was like nothing they did could get this fire to go out. And then finally, Henry grabbed one last bucket, and with the last of his energy, he got right below the dome, sort of with his arms out in the balcony, and he looked up, and he chucked the water right onto the roof. And as he did, he suddenly felt this blinding pain come over his whole body, but somehow it sort of felt localized in his stomach, but definitely it was his whole body. And he turned and he looked over at his colleagues, like in shock, like he can't even believe, like, what's causing this pain? And his colleagues, they look at him and they see he's smoldering. There's smoke coming off of him. And so clearly he's on fire. And so they start taking their buckets and they're dousing Henry with water. And Henry's like, oh my God, I'm on fire. And he feels this horrible pain in his stomach. And finally he just blurts out to them, we gotta get out of here. Like, leave it, we gotta go. And so the three of them, they abandon the buckets, abandon the fire, and they bolt out of the lighthouse. And they make their way to a cave on the coast of this island. And there they stayed in this cave overnight as their lighthouse burned to the ground. And all night, Henry, even though now, the fire that had begun on his clothes, it had obviously been put out, but he still had this awful pain that really felt localized in his stomach. It was like this burning, awful pain, and he just couldn't figure out, like, what is that? Is it from being on fire? Was I not aware of how long I was on fire for? Is this just like the result of an extreme burn? Is this smoke inhalation? Like, he didn't know, but he was just happy to be alive. And finally, the sun came up the next morning, and these three men are huddled in this cave, and luckily there was a ship on the horizon that spotted this smoldering ruin of the lighthouse, and they came in, they scooped the three men up, and they brought them back to mainland England. Once they arrived in England, Henry's two younger co-workers made sure to help get Henry to his home, and then when he was there, they called for a doctor, because Henry was still complaining about this really intense feeling in his stomach, and just obviously the fire had really taken a toll on him. And so the doctor shows up, and they perform an examination on Henry, And they see that, yes, you do have significant burns on your body. Clearly you were at one point on fire. And, to Henry, he couldn't quite believe it because, his memory of the night was just, throwing water up on the roof and being so frustrated, like he didn't even realize it, that at some point he'd been on fire. It was just all of a sudden, he had this sudden blinding pain, and before long he had been doused with water, and that was it. But he still just had this awful pain in his stomach. And the doctor told him, like, look, I don't know exactly what that pain is from, but very likely when you were on fire / when you were right near the fire, you were inhaling a lot of smoke. And that can absolutely cause a really intense burning sensation in your lungs. And so just apply this ointment to your burns, take care of your burns, and eventually your burns will heal, and that feeling in your gut, like in your core, from the smoke inhalation will pass. And so for the next several days, Henry did as the doctor ordered. He applied his ointment to all of his burns, he rested and just drank lots of water and just basically waited for all these pains and ailments to go away. But over the coming days, he didn't get better. He got worse. Not only would that pain in his stomach just not go away, but also he developed a really bad fever. And then finally, 12 days after the fire, Henry died.
No.
Now, on one hand, Henry's death was really not shocking. I mean, he was 94 years old. People die when they're in their mid-90s. It's sort of a natural thing. But at the same time, he was like a really active, rugged guy. And it just seemed like, how is it possible he's died from what appears to be sort of relatively superficial injuries here? I mean, he definitely got burned. He had real burns on his body, and he had clearly some smoke inhalation going on. But the doctor said, like, that shouldn't have been enough to kill him. He should have, weathered this and been okay. Maybe he did die from natural causes, but this just feels wrong. Like something else must have happened here. And so ultimately, the doctor decided to perform an autopsy on Henry. And at first, when the doctor began the autopsy, everything kind of checked out, that Henry did appear to, have just passed away, and, he's 94, it is what it is. Until he cut open Henry's stomach. When he saw what was in there, he was horrified. It would turn out, during the fire, when Henry was out on the balcony lobbing buckets of water onto the roof to try to put the fire out, well, at some point, right before he felt that burning sensation in his gut, he looked up as he was throwing the water and his mouth was open, and at the same time he did that, a piece of molten lead from the dome that was on fire dripped down and fell into his mouth, and he swallowed it. A 4-inch piece of molten lead landed in his gut, destroyed his stomach, and then cooled and hardened in his stomach. That was the pain he was feeling. And then he also caught on fire about at the same time. And so in the chaos of the moment, despite this blinding pain he's feeling in his stomach, everybody else is looking at him saying, oh my gosh, you're on fire. That's what the problem is. They douse him with water. And even after he's had the flames extinguished and he's complaining of this pain in his stomach, no one's thinking it can be anything other than the fact you were just recently on fire. That's got to be it. Smoke inhalation, connected to your burns, whatever it is. No one's thinking it could be anything else. Today, that same piece of lead is actually on display at the National Museum of Scotland.
That looks huge. I don't know what 4 inches look like. Like, I can't do it with my hands, but I can only imagine 4 inches. Okay, I want to say this is about 1 inch. Right. I think. So 3 more of these. 3 more of these. Is that it? I don't know. I feel like 4 inches. Like, how do you, bro. In the context of that situation, him swallowing that is 4 inches. But it was molten. So it's like, how you not feel it going down? Like, was it just like a straight shot? Like to your, oh God. And it's just burning on the way down. Oh God. That's a lighthouse for you. Oh man. I thought he was going to say one of his co-workers or one of the people that was drunk did something crazy to him. Oh my God. Oh, I'm glad they're doing light, not no fire no more. Jesus Christ. But with that first story, you would have to pay me. I don't know how much people get paid to do them oil rigs and all that. Being out there, I would, what is it, $500,000? At least. I'm gonna need a few million a year. Cause that whole job in itself is a hazard and dangerous. I wonder if anybody can do that, or like you have to pass like a certain test to go out there. Jesus, keep it cool, keep it classy. Now I know your health insurance that you get from that job is on point. Keep it cool, keep it classy, and I love you. Stay happy, my family.